Hi guys, so today we're taking a look at the Fender American original series of guitars, which Fender released just before the NAMM show. This line of guitars looks to be replacing the American vintage line, which have been around since 2012. In this video we're going to focus on the American original Strats and Teles and see how they differ from the American vintage line. I'd love to know what you guys think of this new line in the comment section below, and if you like what you see here, don't forget to subscribe to the Blue Shed. So the first thing that strikes me about this new line is the simplicity. So Fender keep it simple, and instead of honing in on a specific year, Fender keep it to 2 decades. They offer the 50s models and the 60s models. First, let's take a look at the 50s Strats. And as with the original 1954 Strat, all the 50s models come with a maple fingerboard. And at the moment, Fender are offering 3 different finish options on the 50s Strats. We've got a white blonde, an Aztec gold, and a 2-color sunburst. In keeping with Fender traditions, the white blonde has an ash body, and the 2-color sunburst and Aztec gold both have elder bodies. Now let's check out the 50s Strats in a bit more detail as we run through the specs. So the 50s Strat come with either an ash body on the white blondes or an elder body on the Aztec gold and 2-color sunburst. The pickups are the vintage 59 single coils, and the necks are a thicker soft V profile with maple fretboards on a 9.5 inch radius, and bending is made easier with tool vintage frets. The 50s Strat come well equipped with vintage hardware, with a 6-point trem and vintage tuning keys, and these are all finished with a nitrocellulose lacquer. The 50s vibe is nicely captured with the ash body option, old school maple necks, and the spaghetti logo on the headstock. Now let's take a look at how the 50s American original Strats compare to the American vintage line. Perhaps the first thing we notice with this comparison is the loss of the later 50s style specs. With the older vintage line, we had both a 56 and 59 model, and these 59 models were available as both a rosewood and maple fingerboard option. This isn't the case with the originals, and if you're after a Strat with more of a 50s vibe but with a rosewood fingerboard, this isn't possible. If you do want a rosewood fingerboard option, you have to go for the 60s original for that and settle for the 60s vibe, including the transition style larger logo on the headstock. And of course, with the originals you'll have a more modern radius and taller frets, but Fender has also changed the nitrocellulose application process. Gone is the flash coat thin skin nitro application process, which was used on the vintage line, and rumour has it that Fender has shot the nitro over a poly base coat. Now let's move over to the 60s Strats. So in the early 60s, Fender started using rosewood as a fingerboard material, so it's no surprise here that the original 60s models come with rosewood fingerboards. So again, we have 3 finish options. We have a 3-color sunburst, an Olympic white, and a candy apple red, and each of these has an elder body. So let's take a closer look at the 60s Strat specs. The only body material available on the 60s Strats is elder, and the pickups are the 65 vintage single coils. The necks are a thicker C-shaped profile, again with a 9.5 inch radius and vintage tool frets. The hardware carries plenty of vintage vibes in a 6-point tremolo system and vintage tuning pegs. All the 60s Strats are finished in a nitrocellulose lacquer, and the 60s vibe is nicely captured with the mint green pick guards, rosewood fingerboards, and the bigger transition logo on the headstock. Now let's take a look at how the 60s American original Strats compare with the American vintage line. We see fewer differences between the 60s original and the 65 vintage Strats. Both Strats have similar neck profiles, similar 65 pickups, and similar color options. The differences here are primarily down to the new modern appointments on the originals versus the vintage correct specs on the vintage line. The 7¼ inch radius has been replaced with 9.5, and the vintage frets replaced with vintage tool. With these modern appointments aside, perhaps the most obvious difference is only with the mint green guards on the 60s originals. Now over to the Teles, and we'll start with the 50s Telecaster. The American original 50s Telecaster is based off the classic 1952 Tele, and it comes with a thick U-shaped maple neck and is available in the butterscotch blonde finish only. So let's take a closer look at the 50s Tele specs. The 50s Tele have the classic butterscotch blonde ash body combination and is the only option of the 50s Tele range. The pickups are the vintage 52 single coils, and the necks a thick U-shaped profile with a 9.5 inch radius and vintage tool frets. There's plenty of vintage vibe in the hardware, with brass barrel saddles and the vintage tuning pegs. Like the Strats, the 50s Tele is finished in a nitrocellulose lacquer, And the 50s vibe is nicely captured with the old school blackguard Tele look. Now let's take a look at how the American original 50s Tele compares with the American vintage line. The original 50s Tele offers a single option which matches quite closely to the American vintage 52. Aside from the more modern appointments on the original 50s, we have similar neck profiles and both capture that early 50s blackguard Tele vibe almost identically. Gone from the original line is the later 58 option, where the vintage 58 offered not only a different finish option in white blonde, but marked a period where Fender changed to a thinner neck profile. So if you're after something a little less substantial than the thick U in the original 50s Tele line, you might have to check out the 60s original Teles instead. So now over to the American original 60s Teles. So back in the early 60s, Fender started using binding on the bodies and also introduced rosewood fingerboards. So it's no surprise that the 60s Tele have both of these in their spec sheet. And again, we have three finish options. We've got a Lake Placid blue, a Fiesta red, and a three color sunburst. These are all elder bodies. So let's take a closer look at the specs of the American original 60s Tele. The 60s Teles all feature an elder body with binding, and the pickups are vintage 64 single coils. The necks are a mid-60s C-shaped profile, and the hardware is vintage inspired with vintage tuning keys and steel saddles. Once again, these guitars are finished in nitrocellulose lacquer. The 60s vibe is nicely captured with a Tele custom style, with the body binding, 60s colours and rosewood fingerboards. So let's take a look at how the 60s American original Teles compare with the American vintage line. We see a few differences with the two Tele lines. Perhaps the most striking are the colour options, adding a Lake Placid blue and Fiesta red to the mix, along with some body binding as well. However, on the originals, elder bodies are only available, and on the vintage line we did see an ash option present in the mix. All in all, the new 60s original Teles definitely carry a different vibe, similar to that of the custom Telecaster of the early 60s. So now on to some final thoughts on the new range. I think Fender have played it fairly safe with the originals, offering some of the most popular specs with regards to frets, radius and vintage vibe. It's been several years since the vintage hot rods were released and discontinued, and players wanting these kind of specs had to fork out for custom shop models or go Mexican with the classic player series. So once again, you can have the vibe and tone of a vintage guitar, but with all the functionality and playability of modern Strat or Tele. I like the Fender have kept things relatively simple, offering two of the most iconic decades, covering perhaps the most important transition between the 50s and 60s. You simply pick your decade. This wasn't the case with the American vintage, where we had 52s, 56s, 58s, 64s and 65s, all with subtle differences. But on the other hand, these subtle differences would perhaps be make or break for the die-hard vintage enthusiast. Some may also take notice that the nitro finish on the American originals is applied over a poly base coat and filler, and Fender doesn't appear to be using their thin skin or flash coat application techniques which were used on the American vintage line. Whether these guitars will age as gracefully as their predecessors, perhaps only time will tell. Some may also choose to wait and hope that Fender release some limited edition colour runs, as some of the finish options are rather limited. Anyway, I hope that video gives you a good overview of the new American original line, and I'd love to know what you guys think of the new lineup in the comment section below. And if you like what you see here, don't forget to subscribe to Blue Shed for more videos like this. But most of all, thank you guys for stopping by.